Actually, I'm going to do the same thing.
Dennis, why don't we begin?
Good afternoon. I'm Dennis Galucki, and welcome to the 396th Imagine Greater Buffalo program and another virtual Imagine program hosted by the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us today. This program is created by ImagineLifelongLearning.com and the Center for the Study of Art and Architecture, History, and Nature, or C-SAAHN, as I like to pronounce the acronym. We're going to start with our speaker shortly, but first, a little housekeeping. Everyone watching will be muted during our speaker's presentation, which will last about 15 minutes or so. We'll have some time for questions at the end. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll get to as many as we can. This program is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it again later on the library's Facebook and YouTube channels, pages, and we encourage you to share the link for those resources with your networks. As a reminder, we'll be here on Zoom every Tuesday at 12:30 p.m. with a great lineup of local speakers and using the same link. Now, today is the third Tuesday of the month. So our primary theme is history and future. We look back so we better can understand as a community where we're heading and imagine it. And our secondary theme is Imagine Greater Buffalo as a premier cultural and nature center. Our featured speaker today is Doug Kohler. Doug is a local historian and author who has written extensively about early Western New York. In addition to teaching at Clarence Middle School, he has served as the Erie County Historian for the last 12 years. He has degrees in history and education from Canisius College. He has written 5 books on Clarence and edited the Hull House Bicentennial book. Additionally, he writes frequently for Western New York Heritage Magazine. In 2011, the Buffalo and Erie County Historical Society honored him with the Owen B. Augsburger Award, which recognizes local historians devoted to the preservation of Erie County's heritage. And now let's welcome Doug Kohler, who is going to talk about Erie County's bicentennial. Doug?
Good afternoon, and thank you. I am in fact coming to you from the science storeroom of Clarence Middle School. It's just sort of the world we live in. I would much rather be with all of you in the circle of knowledge at the library, but this is kind of the world and the age in which we live. And I appreciate Dennis and the library inviting me back to participate in another Imagine Buffalo event. And what we want to do is I'm going to try and do 2 things in the next 25 minutes or so. First, I'm going to share my screen. It looks like it's showing. Can everybody, is that looking all right? Somebody give me a thumbs up. That's what I do with my virtual students. Everybody seeing those? All right, I got a thumbs up from Dennis, so we're good to go. So what I'd like to do in the next 25 minutes is talk first. Dennis posed this question to me a couple of weeks ago in our last Bicentennial Planning Committee meeting, which is why? Why does Erie County 200 matter? What's the significance of it? So I want to take about 10 minutes, and I've been sort of refining this over the last week as I've been putting my pieces together. And then what I want to do is talk about, so it's kind of a where we are coming from and a where we're going in terms of what it is that we're trying to do with the bicentennial, some of the efforts that we've made, and what we envision coming in the next year-ish plus. Because obviously the pandemic has put a wrench in our plans, as it has in everybody's plans throughout the world, for that matter. So with that, Dennis's question was, why does this why does this matter? And the answer is, in one word, I would say legacy. Oh, wait. Legacy, great. Legacy in terms of, I think, in a couple of ways, that idea of us being linked to history. And I know that every community throughout the United States, throughout the world, is going to say, but we have history. And that's certainly true. But having traveled extensively throughout the United States, our history is, I would like to think, is different. It's deeper. And it's extant. It exists. I remember, and I think it's one of the formative moments of sort of my becoming a local historian. Years ago, I went to Cleveland and wanted to go to the Millionaires Row to see the Rockefeller Mansion. I went to the Western Reserve Historical Society and I said, how do I get to Millionaires Row? And they said, oh, well, you go down, down, it's over by Cleveland Clinic, and look for the White Castle. I said, oh. I said, does Millionaires Row start next to the White Castle? And they said, no, that's where it was, where the White Castle is. And that was sort of that moment of revelation that, Cleveland has history and all of these places have history, but so much of it has been changed and in a lot of ways is no more, whereas our history still is. And so to me, it's that legacy that was bequeathed to us, by previous generations that we are fortunate, and I think in the last 20 years have begun to rediscover, to figure what it means to us, whether it's the canal space or architectural, buildings or all of those sorts of things. And how does that represent not just our past, but a bridge to, I think, a very vibrant future for, Western New York, for Buffalo, for Erie County. So I just thought I'd talk for a quick moment about, what are some of those legacy pieces. Clearly the canal is one. And I would, we know the Bowstring Bridge if you go to Canal Side and the foundations that are there. And thankfully they are there, that they weren't reburied because, the weather would cause them to explode, and that we get to see, and experience and walk through history, not a recreation of, but, trace the actual footsteps through those historical points. But again, in that legacy that it all connects, this is the bowstring bridge as it actually looked. And so where we don't have those the actual historical pieces, and we have far more of them than I often think we realize, we've recreated those pieces in ways that meaningfully connect this legacy of what was to what is to, I think, what can be as we go forward into the future. So the canal is certainly, and that's something that many of us are in ongoing discussions about. Again, I fear that we're going to lack, a New York State Canal Bicentennial Commission. But there is a strong and active group here on the western terminus of the canal that is already discussing, what is our piece going to look like in 2025 when we get to that bicentennial. And again, that speaks to this idea of legacy, that the county bicentennial matters because it's part of not just a finite 200 years, but it's simply a milepost that we're at 200 years, but we're moving into the next 25, the next 50, the next 100. So the canal is part. And I wanted to mention just quickly on that. The Explore and More has done an amazing thing down at their water level piece. They've put what local historians all refer to as the golden point, a marker for where the canal met the commercial slip, and which actually became the link between the Great Lakes and points west to the canal and points east. And they've got this beautiful marker right in the sidewalk outside the cafe on their terrace level. And if you haven't seen it, next time we're able to get out and travel, get down and take a look for that. One of the legacy pieces that we on the committee are thinking about, and I think often gets overlooked because it's in some ways less tangible, is this idea of social movements. And because the Underground Railroad, people always say to me, as a local historian, people always say, oh, my house was on the Underground Railroad. And I have to be honest, if I had $1 for everybody who told me their house had been a stop on the Underground Railroad, I wouldn't need a virtual background. I would have enough money to be coming from the Bahamas. And as a local historian, you never want to sort of invalidate that because there is much we don't know. But as I said, if every house that I had been led to as a stop on there, then there was nothing but Underground Railroad. But that doesn't diminish the significance of what that means to us, to the area. Both through Millard Fillmore and sort of what his legacy is as president, signing the Fugitive Slave Act, which is why the Underground Railroad comes through Buffalo, because now enslaved people have to get to Canada to be free in a way they hadn't before Millard Fillmore and the Act of 1850. And certainly, I think, the way in which we celebrate it here, whether it's in Lewiston with their monument or through the history of the Michigan Street Baptist Church or the tours, the sites, and just simply the knowledge that we were sort of that ending point, and we'll talk about the lantern as a symbol in a minute when I show you sort of the bicentennial logo iterations. But then there are other things. There's the Fitch Creche, which we don't talk about, which was created as one of the nation's first daycare facilities, created by the women of Buffalo from Delaware Avenue for the women of Buffalo from the Lower Terrace, for the women of the working class to have a place, for the children to be safe while they were working. And unfortunately, in that legacy piece, the building that was the Fitch Creche is no longer there. It was torn down, as you see here. This is from John Conlon, a piece that he published. It was torn down a little over 20 years ago. But again, that's a story that we don't tell, and one that I think, as the Bicentennial Committee, we're very aware of in making sure that we tell, in addition to those others, is the Niagara movement, and this idea that the forerunner of the NAACP was born here in Western New York. And that it was born not just here, but it was, again, born through the actions of women in that African-American community along the Michigan Street corridor, so proximate to the library, but so important in just so many ways to the story. And again, it's not just a was, but it's an is because of the efforts to make that such a vibrant part of our community historically and physically as we move forward. So that's, and again, because those often lack landmarks in the same way that other pieces do, that becomes a how do you tell it? How do we make sure that gets included, not forgotten? And then one of my favorites, while my specialty is early West New York, I also think we miss this, where I think we're doing a better job of talking about, in Mark Twain's words, the Gilded Age, though he probably meant it with a little more pejorative feel than we want to give it. But it speaks to that. It's that Buffalo at the turn of the century. It's when Buffalo was 8th largest city in the country, when it was millionaires and industry and mansions. And I've always said that you go to Europe and you travel and they talk about, I was thinking of Florence, and sort of how the Medicis became patrons of the arts, and that the arts flourished in Florence because the Medicis were financial backers. And we have that in a different but just as tangible way as part of our legacy, and that's the architecture and the art that, because we had millionaires on Delaware Avenue, that money gets channeled back into our civic well-being in buildings that we still have today. It's often been said that E.B. Green was Albright's personal architect, that there was that strong connection, and that these buildings that were created and often by local architects, Green and Wicks, S and Wine and Johnson, that so many of those are still standing today, both in the city core and of course throughout the county and throughout the region. We don't often think of George Carey, but not only did he do the History Museum, but other buildings. That's always my favorite view. The Bridge of the Three Americas, in front of it was the city's gift to the Pan American Exposition. Clarence has the clubhouse that was done in arts and crafts style by S and Wine and Johnson. The electric tower, that's the homage to the electric tower of the Pan American Exposition. And I always love this because there's a great irony here. So this is the house of William Wicks, who was the partner with E.B. Green and Wicks. But does I don't know, Melissa, if there's a way anybody can throw it in the chat and you can tell me, but does anybody know what house E.B. Green's house faces? Because you have E.B. Green, William Wicks, this very staid, formal, half Tudor, staid architecture. Melissa,
Doug, we have someone in the chat who says Martin House.
Exactly.
And someone else as well.
Yeah. So the William Wicks house is directly across the street from Darwin Martin. And when I take tours of the Darwin Martin house or pass through, I've got to think what was running through Wicks' mind as he looked across at a very different style of architecture, as Frank Lloyd Wright's, magnum opus, as he called it, goes up across the street from, an architect who was working in a very different genre, in a very different style. And that dichotomy has always fascinated me of the old literally across the street from the new. So that, that architecture is a legacy in that sense of, the millionaires, being the patrons of not just local, but then the Sullivans, the Richardsons, the Wrights, and what that legacy means to us, that it's still intact and has become such a mover of West New York as we go forward. All right. Obviously the Pan Am, is a legacy piece, and our position, our location. And interestingly, for a long time we saw this as we were a rail hub, we were a port, and now, one has to believe, I'll knock on wood, those cabinets over there, that once we clear this pandemic and we get back to moving, we're a hub in a different way. And I think of it in terms of Frank Lloyd Wright. My wife and I have traveled to Chicago to see Wright stuff, and we were on an all-day tour in Chicago, and the docents in Chicago had just been on a 3-day tour to Buffalo to see our Wright stuff, literally Wright stuff and Wright stuff. And it made for such a fascinating discussion throughout the day as they talked about Wright in Buffalo, and we got to experience Wright in Chicago. And that puts us at a different kind of crossroads of heritage and cultural tourism once we're ready to roll again. So where are we with the Bicentennial? Just trying to be mindful of our time here. Rather than go in chronological chunks, that would be a normal approach to say we're going to look at you know, 1821 to 1871, and then 1871 to 19. But we were, our concern was we didn't want to get exclusionary, that not every community would have something that fits into that first 50 years, because communities were still defining themselves in that period or later on. And so rather, we've tried to approach the bicentennial thematically. We had different hopes for this before the pandemic, but we still view this as our best organizational structure. So rather than time, we looked at what are the themes that are common to all communities, you know, in Erie County as we move forward in the bicentennial. So access and transportation would give communities a chance to connect, whether it's via the canal or railroads, or the big one that always comes up when I'm speaking is, you know, the aircraft industry of Cheektowaga. So, you know, how do we access Erie County? How do we, you know, how did we manage transport, whether it's streetcars or automobiles, or the impact of something like the Skajackwada Expressway, as you look at, you know, at what that did to the Humboldt neighborhood. So we've tried to draw these large to give communities, groups, organizations chances to tie in any way that they see. Pioneers, again, not just the first settler in a community, that could be a pioneer. But I always think of work that I've done in Clarence with Wilson Greatbatch, who was a pioneer with the implantable pacemaker, or you know, the O'Sheas and the windshield wiper. It can be so much. It can be a pioneer in any way that we see that. Agriculture and industry, you know, you've the Gilded Age, the height of Buffalo industry. You've got the new industries, the biomedical corridor. You've got agriculture still in huge swaths of the county. Culture and leisure, you know, Dennis and I were chatting when we opened. Dennis was wearing his Bills hat. We have Bills Day coming up on Thursday, Friday here at the middle school. You know, you can't divorce that from who we are as a community. And so all of the different aspects of culture and leisure. Reform and revolution is what we were talking about, with sort of those social movements. And then neighbors and community, you know, whether it's the immigrant communities and neighborhoods of the 1800s, or the new immigrant communities of the 2000s on the west side, and those communities have added such diversity to who we are. So those groupings, and we encourage any, you know, all groups, anybody who wants to be involved, to think about how do those themes apply to you. Now, this is cool because you are all going to get to see our latest iteration. So we've been working on drafts of the logo. And I would encourage you in the chat, if you have strong feelings, we can get into this in the Q&A in just a moment. But these are version 3s. But one of the things I call your attention to and ask you to feedback to us in the chat is, do you prefer the one on the option 1 with the open banner, or do you prefer option 2 on the right with the colored banner? Just as a way of tossing that out there. Now, bearing in mind, these are drafts. We are hoping to have the final in about 2 weeks, but we're still soliciting feedback. We did roll these out to some sample groups, including my students here. And there is strong feeling, but again, I want you to, you know, if one of them strikes you as, if you have strong feelings about one or the other, please put that in the chat. But here is our current iteration. And so I want you to feed it back to us on this. So we took those and we've modified, and this is the first I know Dennis is seeing them. I got him at 11 o'clock this morning. But in talking to our group, we said, we've got a live group. It looks like we've got 30-ish people here. But so what we did is we sort of took those ideas. We've added the lantern at the top. And I'm really going to let you sort of absorb for a minute before I walk you through the why we're thinking. But you notice that the lantern is new to this iteration, and so is the buffalo. Our question here is, our social media hashtags will be EC200, obviously. Does the logo work with that as the main push? Does the logo work better, Erie County Bicentennial, with the dates bracketing it? Do we like the lantern with the lightning bolts in color or so? So just whatever, and I will try and be, this is the one thing I struggle with as a teacher, is I'm going to try and be quiet for about 20 seconds and just sort of let you look and think and feedback. And then I've got one more thing for you to look at.
So Doug, I'll tell you the responses right now are kind of let's say we've got 4 for the logo on the left and 2 for the logo on the right.
Okay, good to know. And what I have some other, that's good. Thanks, Melissa, for letting me know.
3 more for the one on the left now.
The one on the left seems to be, all right.
Definitely the most popular one.
Okay. I'll give you some framework on our thinking. And again, we're talking to Melissa Brown at the History Museum, Jason Hurley, who's our partner in the county executive's office. And by the way, Mark apologizes. We'd invited him. Dennis said, could I tag team this with Mark? But obviously, with the current situation and the vaccine situation, Mark is unable to join us. But he's intimately involved with what's going on in the work of the committee. So, but just the COVID situation made it such that he couldn't be here. But the lantern, we thought, kind of struck at a couple of chords. On the History Museum, there are those frieze panels. If you've ever looked at them, there's one that is conductor on the Underground Railroad leading some enslaved people to freedom, and they're holding prominently in front a lantern. But we also thought with sort of the electric bolts that's on the City of Buffalo flag that's become predominant lately, that represents not just the light of freedom, the light of the rising sun, but also that electric power that was such a theme for the Pan American Exposition, which is obviously an important part of the electric power that still generates from Western New York. So we sort of saw that as handled. You've got the hills. We're trying to give a little nod to sort of, we don't want this to be Buffalo centric in the sense of it's a celebration of 27 towns and cities in Erie County, but that Buffalo is still part of our identity. So that's why we thought, more of the throwback standing Buffalo instead of, we want to speak to that without overwhelming the logo and representing all of the constituencies, at least in broad terms, as we go. All right, any other, so I encourage you, I'm going to show you one other piece that could go with this. If you have other thoughts, please put them in the chat. Melissa will share those with me and we will get those back to the committee as we sort of enter our final round of refinements on this. This would be one other option for the banner. There's one that's mocked up for this, but if any of those speak to you, I'd be interested to know that as well. And certainly, in a minute, or when we get into the Q&A, if you want to revisit, talk about, I'm happy to scroll back through the slides. We can go back and revisit. But this is just a thought of, is it possible to work in our social media hashtag with the Bicentennial? The thought being, if it's EC200, do you need the word Bicentennial in the banner? I have my own thoughts, but as I said, I don't want to poison the well. So we'll just sort of let you mull. I'm going to share 2 more thoughts, and I know we're closing in on time for Q&A. So one of the things we are doing is we're doing an education subcommittee with Reach Out. We especially in this day and age, teachers. I know I'm working 12 hours a day. I've been doing this 32 years, and I'm working harder than I did when I started. To create digital materials. And so one thing our committee is going to, and yes, that is me with the gold pan. That's a long story, but we're looking for a whole variety of ways in which to reach out with our stories of legacy to get them into the hands of students. But we do have an education committee. If that's something that you have thoughts or interest in, you can reach out to Dennis. Dennis can get that to me. We'd be happy to talk to any constituent groups, anybody who thinks they have thoughts on that. And then I'll let this sort of launch us into Q&A. We're working on a number of things in terms of the calendar. What will this look like from April 2nd, 2021, at least through next fall, and maybe it rolls over a little bit before we get to April 2 of 2022, because that's really the bicentennial year. Our calendar, our programming, we have a programming committee that is looking at speakers. Obviously, we will need to start virtually, but Dennis's model is a huge success. Melissa's got a model at the History Museum. At this point, everybody can Zoom. So we'll start there and, hope that by next fall, we're at a place where, at least some of the fall events can look more like we're used to, like we would hope that they would. A lot of the smaller historical organizations are working on a passport model like the art cars, if you remember back that far, or the Buffaloes. that would involve traveling to, even if it's in cars. We're looking to incorporate historical markers to try and do a survey of what markers do we know about? Are there markers we're missing? Are there markers that don't exist but should? And at the top of our list is the Curtiss Wright facility over by the airport, that produced, so many aircraft during World War II. There is no marker for that. And that's obviously one, but what are the other ones that, markers that should be thought about as we move through this year? And can that be part of our ongoing legacy moving into the future is creating markers for, as Catherine Schweitzer calls it, the museum of the streets for our county. Rather than reinvent, we're looking at rebranding a lot of issues, using the logo, using the connections. The Bicentennial is forging with Visit Buffalo Niagara. VBN is working hand in hand with us to promote our events and to make sure that the word gets out as far and wide as we can. And then we are developing, the county is developing a website, an EC200 website. We are hoping to go live with it the week of February 1st. With the logo, with the website, with links to VBN, with events that we know already are going to be taking place, and that will sort of kick us into the next year as we move towards a formal kickoff on April 2nd of 2021. So with that, I've gotten pretty close. At this point, I would let's move to questions and answers. Dennis, would that give me a thumbs up or not?
That would be perfect. Melissa will mention if there's any other questions in the chat. Melissa?
Yes. The first question is, what is the significance of the building in the logo?
I'm so glad somebody asked that question. So when we started, the challenge, and anybody, I know there are a couple of people in the Zoom today who are on the committee and have been in our large planning meetings. The goal is not to try and tell our story in a logo, but rather what we sought to do was try and find things that are emblematic of the county, which speak to its historical legacy, but also big picture stuff. And so we wanted to make sure that, as we said, it isn't Buffalo centric, that it's not canal centric. Those are easy pieces that need to be there. But how do we especially, kind of make sure we acknowledge the rural heritage, the agrarian heritage of the county? And so our designer put a barn in there, and I said, I like it, but it was just a barn. So I said, could we, and so I sent some ideas of barns that are unique to Erie County, and that is a Pennsylvania bank barn that is common throughout the northern tier. It was created, built, and brought here by Pennsylvania Dutch settlers in the 1830s. And if you travel through like the Shenandoah Valley or Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, they're all over. And we have sort of this critical mass, or had, unfortunately, most are gone, but we still got about 4 that are left. This, critical mass of these architecturally significant barns. So, that's sort of that agrarian heritage piece, the farm piece, the hills on the left to represent sort of the southern part of the county. But that's why the barn, and thank you. So, and again, not just a barn, but an Erie County, a barn that has significance to Erie County. It's a great question.
We have to watch our time.
Yeah.
And that's a great explanation. Last week we had David Granville speaking of the Tesla, and I'm intrigued how he pointed out the lightning bolt that's in Tesla's hand in that sculpture in front of M&T, and here you put them in the lantern. It's a nice connection. I think that we've stumbled up here.
Yeah, it ties so many things. That ties so much together. Yeah.
All right.
Time for one more question?
Doug, give us your email so that anybody listening and future audiences can contact you for either thoughts or wanting to be involved. This is open. It's been open for a couple of years for those interested in local history. This is your chance to have input and learn a lot. So many good groups like Explore Buffalo and others are out there. Hull House, History Museum itself. So get involved. Doug, I assume this part is pretty close to a volunteer position. That
My job?
As the historian, maybe whatever it is, they can't pay you enough to do this job.
Yeah,
So,
the quote when I met the county historian who appointed me, he said, "I always love to meet a volunteer," which I was prepared for walking in, but it's a labor of love kind of thing. It's just, and luckily my family supports me in this and loves history as well, so it couldn't
all
work out.
right. So give that email address. Is that a good way to be contacted, or
Absolutely.
would you prefer something else?
Nope. Email is great. You can reach me at Doug, D-O-U-G, Kohler, K-O-H-L-E-R, and the number 1, Doug Kohler 1 @gmail.
Okay, good. Got that, folks? This is your time to give input on these samples that Doug put up and influence the outcome. So please do so. And again, share this link, archival link, with your networks, and word will get out. We're all trying to figure our way here when we don't have a physical world to deal with. Thank you for your kind comments through this, Doug. Let me thank everybody for joining us today, and invite you to join us next week, same time, same Zoom link, when we hear from Marissa Wigglesworth, President and CEO of the Buffalo Museum of Science. She'll be imagining a 21st century Buffalo Museum of Science. That's the title we've assigned for her. So let's come on back next week and let's hear about that. I'm Dennis Galucki. Let's get our priorities straight and wish the Bills well. Go Bills. But folks, be well and have a good afternoon.
Thank you. Melissa, can you, if there's anything really significant